From about 900 to 1350, Europe experienced continuous population and economic growth. However, starting in 1347, an outbreak of a disease which was later labeled the Black Death occurred, and this would really threaten all the gains that Europe had made over the last several centuries. So today I'd like to take a look at the Black Death and its impact on European development. Normally, when we think of the Black Death, people simply call it the plague, and if they're pressed to elaborate that answer, they will say bubonic plague. However, that's not technically correct, and actually this plague is caused by the bacteria Yersinia Pestis, and if we want to be really technical, we should just refer to the disease as Yersinia Pestis. However, that sounds kind of boring, so we'll probably just call it the plague or the Black Death. It has a little bit more of a ring to it. So this is actually a common bacteria which is carried by rats and other vermin. This is probably the same thing as Justinian's plague, and it's probable that the 6th century outbreak was sort of the earlier form of what would later become called the Black Death. And by the way, the label Black Death wasn't given to this disease until many years after this time period. Now, this bacteria can then cause 3 varieties of plague, which to the victims probably don't seem all that different, but if you're studying it medically, they're quite different. One, the most common form, is the bubonic plague, and this is the form that most people would have gotten during an outbreak. And what this is when all the lymph nodes in someone's body swell, like the lymph nodes on this person's thigh here. And this version of the disease is not as deadly as the others. Now, the untreated death rate is no less than 30% and maybe as much as 90%. This depends on a lot of things, such as the health and age of the victim. But, this is something which is not necessarily a death sentence, although you probably need to write a will if you don't already have one and you see buboes forming. Another form that is a lot more rare is the pneumonic plague, and this is an infection which is centered on the lungs. This is way deadlier. I don't know the numbers, but it is well in excess of 90% fatality rate. But the most devastating form of the plague that you could possibly get is the septicemic plague. There we go. And this is where the plague bacteria gets in the blood and causes an infection. And if you have septicemic plague, you are dead. There's no other way to put it. And that might also include some forms of treatment. I'm actually not 100% clear on that. Anyway, these are the 3 actual varieties of plague which are caused by Yersinia Pestis. And as you might guess from the fact that this is a common bacteria and it's carried by rats and vermin, as Europe grew in size and its cities grew faster than their sanitation methods, Europe was especially vulnerable to this kind of an outbreak. So while the focus of this video is on the impact of the Black Death in Europe, the Black Death actually was a global disease and had a big impact on the rest of the world as well, at least the old world. So this Black Death most likely broke out first in Central Asia in the 1330s and then spread both east and west from there. The first time that it reaches the Western world is in 1347 when there's an outbreak in Constantinople. And by 1353, the Black Death had broken out all across Europe, but for whatever reason, it spared the majority of Poland. I have no idea why that would be, but that is kind of how it went. Everywhere else, though, they got hammered by the Black Death. Let's now talk about the demographic impact of the Black Death, or to put it more bluntly, how many people died because of this plague. Well, we have a lot of data which is at variance with other pieces of data. We have some individual city records which record 50 to 60% of the population being wiped out. However, we also have estimates for the Middle East, and there it looks like it was about 1/3 of the total population. It looks like Europe got hit a little harder than the Middle East, but if we balance out the high casualty rates in cities with the most likely lower rates in rural areas, then this means that Europe would have lost about 30 to 40% of its total population during the Black Death outbreak. And the population will then decline some after 1347 all the way until 1420, and then it will be stable for about 50 years and then begin growing again at a slow rate from about 1470 on. There's a considerable economic impact whenever a large percentage of the population ups and dies the way that it did during the Black Death. And one of the immediate impacts is that now you have fewer people who have the same or a very similar amount of resources to work with. I say similar because some animals seem to have died as well, but not on the same scale as humans. So this means that now there's a greater prosperity per capita or per head. So the average person has more stuff, in other words. And another impact of that is that because there are fewer workers to hire, it now becomes a worker's paradise in a way, in the sense that workers are now in scarce supply and they're in a much better position from which to negotiate their wages. So if you want to hire a construction crew in a time when there's a lot of people around, you can lowball them and basically force them to work for less, because if they're not willing to take that rate of pay, someone else will. But if you're in a city where you need a workforce and you basically only have so many people, there really aren't any other options. So you have to pay these people what they're willing to work for. And that gives the workers a lot more options than they'd had before, and more options than they'll have later. And as you might imagine, this leads to an average standard of living increase for the average person. And this was especially felt in some Italian city-states where you have artisans and others who work in the city. And someone was talking about how in the sort of post-plague world, workers were bringing lunches in which had lots of goodies in them, lots of sort of luxury things like olives. And then you get 100 or 150 years later, when the population has recovered, and we see that lunches have become a lot more sparse because these workers are a lot less prosperous than their ancestors had been. On the other hand, though, there are sometimes famines and food shortages which result from having devastating outbreaks of the plague, because it's harder to farm and harvest when you have fewer people to do it. This is an era before the tractor and corporate farming, and it takes a lot of manpower to work a farm and collect all of the fruits of one's labor. Now, kings, nobles, and merchants are basically on the same side when it comes to this labor issue, and they try to implement wage freezes. However, these are ineffective because of the laws of supply and demand. Workers can, afford to sort of hold out until they get what they want. And part of the reason why kings and nobles are so big on trying to implement a wage freeze is because their own revenues will have declined due to the fact that they now have fewer taxpayers. So that's their motive. Merchants, their motive is obviously that they don't want to pay people any more than they have to. But for kings especially, the motive is more that they have diminished revenue due to this population drop-off. For people who lived through the Black Death, whether they themselves got sick or not, this would have been a life-altering experience, and it would have created a lot of unrest in their minds about the state of the world and their place in it. And because of this, there is a lot of social unrest that is unleashed across Europe. So first of all, people are looking for a scapegoat. They think that this is some act of malice or judgment from God. So one thing that a lot of people do is find scapegoats in the form of foreigners living on their land, gypsies, Jews, other groups that are kind of outside and distrusted. And what they'll do is then blame them for the outbreak of this plague and persecute them. We also have a society of flagellants. These are basically ascetic critics of worldliness in the church. These guys date back to the 13th century, many years before the outbreak of the Black Death. And these are guys who travel around and beat themselves. That's where they get their name, flagellant. And these beatings are supposed to make up for their sins. And they rise to a fever pitch anytime there's a natural disaster because, in their minds, all natural disasters are messages from God. Well, what greater message could there be than having a third or more of your population dropping dead within a matter of 6 or 7 years across a whole continent? So this really brings the flagellants to a high point. And if you sort of want a visual example, look up the scene from the movie The Seventh Seal, where there are flagellants marching around, beating themselves, and calling for prayer and repentance. Now, the Jacquerie in 1358 was mostly a peasant revolt in France that was related to the 100 Years' War and the ineffectiveness of the French government, but a lot of the general discontent that peasants felt was spurred on by the plague. So this outbreak of plague could also be seen as a judgment of God against a political system. So if you're a French peasant and you see your government getting pounded by the English crown, and then something like this breaks out, and maybe you don't have quite enough perspective to know that this is going on all across Europe, you could possibly see this as the end of sort of a divine support for your monarchy. And so that could have been one of the contributing factors to the Jacquerie and some other peasant revolts which occur around the same time as the Black Death. Medieval European culture already dealt with death quite a bit. After all, this is a society when we have many children who don't grow up to be adults, and many adults who drop dead quite young for no discernible reason, given the technology and medical knowledge available to the people who witnessed their deaths. So, death was already a part of medieval European culture. However, as is almost always the case, whenever you have a development in the contemporary conditions of life, this will be reflected in the culture. And what we see is that this emphasis on death and the afterlife and things like that will become much more prominent in late medieval art than it had been before. We see this both in terms of visual things and also in writings. Although I do have to point out that Dante's Inferno, which is all about what happens to you after you die, was actually written before the Black Death. I had actually thought that it was after the Black Death, and I was going to use that as part of my argument, but Wikipedia does exist. Okay. So, one possible impact of this is that because this devastating event will create this sort of irrational backlash and will really cause people to doubt what they know about the world, you could make the argument that the outbreak of the Black Death probably did help to slow down the progress of the Renaissance to some extent. Not to mention that any kind of great cultural movement requires a lot of money and resource investment, and when your population is drastically reduced, that means that it is harder to attain patronage for being an artist or a great thinker. Although the general rise in prosperity will also be somewhat conducive to something like a Renaissance. So maybe this is more of a split even thing, and to be fair, this is just something that I'm kind of trying to infer from the information that I do have. But anyway, so I might be wrong on that, but something for you to think about. On the other hand, the experience of the Black Death did help to lead to some scientific developments, and these admittedly are some very modest gains. So, how do you respond to something as devastating as the Black Death? Well, you try to figure out what causes it and you try to counteract it to some extent. And is what medieval Europeans came up with. So in 1377, there's yet another outbreak in Italy, and someone develops the idea of using quarantine. So if someone gets sick, they are quarantined in their place, and no one is allowed access to them. And this is some fairly cold stuff, and it goes against all the norms of a family and of society at any time, pretty much. But this is something which can help fewer people become infected and ultimately die. And obviously quarantines are still practiced to this day. There also was an idea that people had to purify the air to eliminate miasma, or what they saw as sort of pollution. And this was meant both in a literal and in a metaphorical sort of religious sense. But this also came from an increasing recognition that the disease was contagious and probably had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere seemed to be the air. This is an idea that was probably taken from someone studying a Greek text by Hippocrates, because supposedly during the plague at Athens during the 5th century BCE, Hippocrates or some of his students had been burning some sort of special wood, and that was supposed to cleanse the air in some way. Anyway, so that seems to be a pretty obvious retread of the ancient Greek idea, and it also didn't work, just like the first time. One other thing that people had figured out is that they needed to remove all the corpses from cities. So the famous Monty Python thing, bring out your dead, that is actually based on something very real. And this was done anyway, even before the outbreak of the plague. But now this will be something that people pay even closer attention to. And people will also start to try to regulate and regularize cemeteries and burial practices to avoid, having shallow burials that'll get dug up by dogs, or, dumping bodies in water, stuff like that. So this will all, make advancements during this period. And in general, there's now more interest in medical science. This is part of the Renaissance and would have happened anyway, but because of something as dramatic as the Black Death, there are probably quite a few people who are kind of scarred for life by their experiences, and, they want to learn more. And so they try to figure out the human body or disease. And maybe this is something which sort of helps to spur this thought process along in some way. According to one study, there was an active plague in at least one place in Europe every single year from 1347, when the plague initially reached Constantinople, all the way until 1671. And over time, these would become less frequent, and obviously some advances in sanitation and other things would ultimately render these outbreaks much less common. The two worst of the subsequent outbreaks were in 1471 and 1479 to 1480, and after that, things started to improve. That's part of the reason why the population will begin to increase after those dates, because those are the last of the really, really bad outbreaks. However, there are some more isolated incidents that are not Europe-wide, which also are pretty devastating. One is the Great Plague of London in 1665, which is recorded very vividly by, I think his name was Samuel Johnson. It's one of the best descriptions of a plague and the social impact of a plague that we have. And there's also the Moscow Plague Riot, where a plague breaks out in Moscow in 1771, and this causes a lot of social chaos and rioting. And there actually are some scholars who think that the social, cultural, and other impacts of the Black Death are so great that they effectively end the Middle Ages. However, I'm not quite convinced of that myself, although I do see some merit in that. But anyway, that is the Black Death and its impact on the course of European history. This really affected labor relations And in many ways, because of this new shift in the balance of power between labor and the people who hire them, this also helps to undermine the basis of the feudal system to a large extent. Although that will be a much longer and more complex process than simply having the Black Death hit Europe. At any rate, that's it for now, and I hope that I've covered this topic in just enough detail for you to really have a general appreciation of what the Black Death was and the impact that it had.